outlaw, bank robber, train robber, guerrilla, leader of a gang. Raised in the Little Dixie area of Missouri, James and his family maintained strong Southern sympathies. Him and his brother Frank James joined pro-Confederate guerrillas known as the Bushwhackers, operating in Missouri and Kansas during the American Civil War. By some, they were accused of committing atrocities against Union soldiers and civilian abolitionists, including the Centreville Massacre that took place in 1864. By others, they were revered as folk heroes who stood up for the people, a modern-day Robin Hood. Well, Jesse James was famous. The guns he used, he made famous as well. Jesse James was born September 5th, 1847, near Kearney, Missouri. Missouri was still fairly new. This area was also known as Little Dixie. James's father actually was a commercial hemp grower at one point for Kentucky, a pastor another. And when the gold rush happened in California, he was one of the people out mining for gold. However, he had died when James was 3 years old. James did have two siblings. One was Alexander Franklin James, or Frank James as most called him, as well as Susan James. Zerilda. James' mother, who was a widow, ended up marrying Benjamin Sims in 1852, whom had died as well, and then in 1855 married Dr. Reuben Samuel, who moved into their home. Jesse's mother and Samuel had 4 children. Zerilda and Samuel acquired a total of 7 slaves who served mainly as farmhands on their tobacco plantation, cultivating the tobacco. The approach of the American Civil War was looming large. The James Samuel household. Missouri was a border state, sharing characteristics of both North and the South, but 75% of the population was from the South or other border states. Clay County in particular was strongly influenced by Southern culture of its rural pioneer families. The farmers raised the same crops and livestock as in the areas from which they had migrated, bringing their slaves with them, 25% of the pop. The county had more slaves per population than all the other counties around it. The culture, aside from slavery, was that of Little Dixie as well. This created turmoil as questioned whether slavery would be expanded into the neighboring Kansas. After a series of campaigns and battles between conventional armies in 1861, guerrilla warfare gripped Missouri and waged between secessionists or the Bushwhackers and Union forces, which largely consisted of local militia known as Jayhawkers. Bitter conflict ensued, resulting in an escalating cycle of atrocities committed by both sides. Confederate guerrillas murdered civilian Unionists and executed prisoners and scalped the dead. The Union presence enforced martial law with raids of homes, arrests of civilians, and summary executions and banishments of Confederate sympathizers from the state. James' family sided with the Confederates at the outbreak of the war. Frank James joined the local company recruited for the secessionist Drew Lobb's army, fought at the Battle of Wilson's Creek. In August 1861, he fell ill and returned home soon afterwards, and in 1863 he was identified as a member of a guerrilla squad that operated in Clay County. Young Jesse was lashed, and that's when it changed from there for him. And at the age of 16, Jesse James had joined Bushwhackers, Confederate. The Confederacy had issues with the small arms they had. The majority of the rifles used at the time were the Springfield 1842, shot the small ball projectile, but the majority of the firearm manufacturers in the United States were actually in the Northeast and were with the Union, whether it be Sam Colt, Oliver Winchester, Smith & Wesson, etc. The Confederacy either had to turn to whichever firearms that people privately owned. Many of the arms were purchased from Einfield, the 1853 smoothbore musket. The Confederacy did establish and utilize Richmond Armory as a major weapons production facility during the Civil War. Armory's machinery and majority of the materials to fabricate and manufacture firearms were captured from the Union Army at Harper's Ferry in 1861. During the Civil War, men like Jesse James and Bloody Bill Anderson carried up to 6 cap and ball handguns at a time. The reason being the case they wouldn't have to stop and reload constantly if they were ambushing somebody. James' primary weapon during his youth was the .36 caliber 1851 Navy Colt revolvers, invented by Sam Colt. You'll notice that he carried 2 in his waistband so he could cross-draw if he was on horseback, like the majority of ambushes or robberies he committed later on in life. However, in 1873, when Colt came out with the single-action Army pistol, having different cartridges, able to reload quickly, it was lighter, and it was in the .45 caliber. It was the revolver that changed the frontier, Wild West, and military. Jesse James began carrying 2 of those around at all times. James preferred pistols over rifles, as he had a fast draw, and he liked to be up close when he shot people. Frank James, Jesse's brother, had eluded capture and was believed to have joined a guerrilla organization led by William Quantrill, known as Quantrill's Raiders. Thought that he took part in a notorious massacre of some 200 men and boys in Lawrence, Kansas. Frank followed Quantrill to Sherman, Texas over the winter of 63 to 64. In the spring, he returned in a squad command by Fletch Taylor. After they arrived, 16-year-old Jesse joined the group. Taylor was severely wounded in the summer of 64, losing his right arm to a shotgun blast. The James brothers then went in bushwhacker group led by William Bloody Bill Anderson. Jesse suffered a serious wound to the chest that summer. The Clay County Provost Marshal reported that both Frank and Jesse took part in the Centralia massacre in September, which guerrillas stopped a train carrying unarmed Union soldiers returning home from duty and killed or wounded 22 of them. The guerrillas scalped and dismembered some of the dead. The guerrillas also ambushed and defeated the pursuing regiment of Major A.V.E. Johnson's Union troops, killing all who tried to surrender, who numbered more than 100. Frank later identified Jesse as a member of the band who had fatally shot Major Johnson. As a result of the James brothers' activities, Union military authorities forced their family to leave Clay County, Missouri. Though ordered to move south beyond Union lines, they moved north across the nearby state border in Nebraska territory. After Bloody Bill Anderson was killed in an ambush in October of the year, the James brothers separated. Frank followed Quantrill into Kentucky, while Jesse went to Texas under the command of Archie Clement, one of Anderson's lieutenants. He's known to have returned to Missouri in the spring at the age of 17. Jesse suffered the second of 2 life-threatening chest wounds when he was shot while trying to surrender after they ran into a Union cavalry patrol near Lexington, Missouri. At the end of the Civil War, Missouri remained deeply divided. The conflict split the population into 3 bitterly opposed factions: anti-slavery Unionists, identified with the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, and pro-slavery or ex-Confederate secessionists, many of whom were all allied with the Democrats, especially in the southern part of the state. Jesse James recovered from his chest wound at his uncle's boarding house in Harlem, Missouri, north across the Missouri River from the city of Kansas's river. He was tended by his cousin Zerelda Zims, named after Jesse's mother. Jesse and his cousin began a 9-year courtship that culminated in their marriage. His former commander, Archie Clement, kept his bushwhacker gang together and began to harass Republican authorities. These men were the likely culprits in the first daylight armed bank robbery in the United States during peacetime. Liberty, Missouri on February 13th of 1866. The bank was owned by Republican former militia officers who had recently conducted the first Republican Party rally in Clay County's history. During the gang's escape from town, an innocent bystander, 17-year-old George C. Wymore, a student at the William Jewell College, was shot dead in the streets. It remains unclear whether Jesse or Frank took part in the robbery after the James brothers successfully conducted other robberies and became legendary. Local violence continued to increase in the state. Governor Thomas Clement Fletcher had recently ordered a company of militia into Johnson County to suppress guerrillas' activity. Archie Clement continued his career of crime and harassment of Republican government to the extent of occupying the town of Lexington, Missouri. On Election Day in 1866, state militia shot Clement dead. James wrote about this death with bitterness. A decade later, sought revenge. James and the other survivors of Clement's gang continued to conduct bank robberies during the next 2 years. Though their numbers dwindled through arrests, gunfights, and lynchings, most of their targets were small local banks based on local capital, and the robberies only penalized the locals that claimed to support. On May 23, 1867, they robbed a bank in Richmond, Missouri, in which they killed the mayor and 2 others. Witnesses who knew the brothers told the newspaper 7 years later positively and empathetically that he recognized Jesse and Frank James among the robbers. Shortly thereafter, Frank and Jesse James allegedly joined the Cole Younger in robbing a bank in Russellville, Kentucky. Though Jesse James did prefer revolvers over having rifles, shotguns, he did have a few cool rifles in his collection, one being an 1860 Henry rifle. This is the model 1873. That was particularly his favorite for hunting, as well as a short length for a saddle rifle, if need be. 1873 was successful. It was known as the rifle, or the gun that won the West. Based off of Benjamin Henry's design for the Henry rifle, Winchester perfected it, adding a side-loading magazine chambered in the .44 Henry cartridge. It was built with a bronze alloy frame and had an improved magazine, wooden forearm. In 1873, they introduced a steel frame model of it, chambering it in the more potent .44-40 centerfire cartridge. In 1876, in a bid to compete with powerful single-shot rifles at the time, Winchester brought the models 1876, while it chambered more powerful cartridges than the 1866 and 1873 models. James would use all of the above. James became well known by December 7th of 1869 when he had robbed the Daviess County Savings Association in Gallatin, Missouri. The robbery netted little money. Jesse believed to have shot and killed the cashier, Captain John Sheets, mistakenly believing him to be Samuel P. Cox, the militia officer who had killed Bloody Bill Anderson during the Civil War. James' claim was taken revenge, and the daring escape he and Frank made through the middle of a posse shortly afterwards attracted newspaper coverage for the first time. Later on in 1882, history of the Daviess County, it's been noted that there's no blacker crime in the pages than the murder of John W. Sheets that day. The only known civil case involving Frank and Jesse James was filed in Common Pleas Court of Daviess County in 1870. In the case, Daniel Smoot asked for $223.50 from Frank and Jesse to replace a horse, saddle, and bridle stolen as they fled the robbery of the Daviess County Savings Bank. The 1869 Davie County's robbery marked the emergence of Jesse James, the most famous survivor of the former Confederate bushwhackers. It was the first time he was publicly labeled an outlaw. Missouri Governor Thomas T. Crittenden said the reward for his capture, "This is the beginning of an alliance between James and John Newman Edwards," editor and founder of the Kansas City Times. Edwards, a former Confederate cavalryman, was campaigning to return former secessionists to power in Missouri. 6 months after the Gallatin robbery, Edwards published the first of many letters from Jesse James to the public asserting his innocence. Over time, the letters gradually became more political in tone, and James denounced the Republicans and expressed his pride in his Confederate loyalties. Together with Edwards' admiring editorials, the letters helped James become a symbol of Confederate defiance of federal Reconstruction policy. James' initiative in creating his rising public profile is debated by historians and biographers, however. High tensions in politics accompanied his outlaw career and enhanced his notoriety. Alan Pinkerton had a private detective agency, Pinkerton National Detective Agency. They were hired by the railroad to arrest Jesse James and the Younger Gang. The Pinkertons had dispatched agent Joseph Witcher to infiltrate Zerrell de Samuel's farm. Not too far after, he was soon found killed. Two other agents, Captain Lewis J. Lowell and John Boyle, were sent after the Youngers. Lowell was killed by two of the Youngers in a roadside gunfight March 17th of 1874. Before he died, Lowell fatally shot John Younger. A deputy sheriff named Edwin Daniels also died in the skirmish. Alan Pinkerton, the agency's founder and leader, took the case as a personal vendetta and began to work with former Unionists who lived near the James family farm. On January 25th of 1875, he staged a raid on the homestead. Detectives threw incendiary devices into the home, making it explode, killing James' young half-brother Archie and blowing off Zerrell de Samuel's arm afterwards. Pinkerton denied the raid's intent was arson. However, later journal entries would prove otherwise. Meanwhile, the James brothers joined with Cole Younger and his brothers John, Jim, and Bob, as well as Clell Miller and other former Confederates, to form what would be known as the James Younger Gang. With Jesse James the most public face of the gang carried out a string of robberies from Iowa to Texas and from Kansas to West Virginia. They robbed banks, stagecoaches, and in a fair in Kansas City, often carrying out their crimes in front of crowds, even hamming it up by bystanders. July 21st, 1873, they turned to train robbery, derailing Rock Island Line train west of Adair, Iowa, and stealing approximately $3,000, which would be about $79,000 in today's money. For this, they wore Ku Klux Klan masks. By this time, the Klan had been suppressed by the South by the President Grant's use of enforcement acts. Former rebels attacked the railroads as symbols of threatening centralization. The gang's later train robberies had a lighter touch. The gang held up passengers only twice, choosing in all their incidents to take only the contents of the express safe and the baggage car. John Edwards made sure to highlight such techniques to create the image of James as a kind of Robin Hood. In 1876, Minnesota, the James Younger Gang attempted to raid on the First National Bank in Northfield, Minnesota, and the robbery went quickly wrong. However, after the robbery, only Frank and Jesse James remained alive and free. Cole and Bob Young later said that they had selected the bank because they believed Republican politicians were running it. The gang attempted to rob the bank in Northfield at 2 p.m. to carry out the robbery. They divided into two groups. Two guarded the door outside, two in.
Joseph Lee Haywood refused to open the safe, claiming it was secure by a time lock, although it wasn't. It was never activated. However, the gang barely escaped Northfield, leaving 2 dead companions behind. They killed Haywood and Niklason Gustaf, the Swedish immigrant from Millsburg community. The James brothers split from others and escaped to Missouri. The militia soon discovered the Youngers and one other bandit, Charlie Pitts, who died in a gunfight. The Youngers were taken prisoner, and except for Frank and Jesse James, the James Younger gang was destroyed. All that was left was the Ford brothers, Charlie and Robert.
The final gun that had a huge significance in Jesse James' life would be the Schofield by Smith & Wesson Model No. 3 revolver. Designed by George W. Schofield, made his own modifications to the model to meet the perceptions the cavalry needs. Smith & Wesson incorporated these into the 1875 design they named after the major planning to obtain significant contracts for this new revolver. The Model 3 was originally chambered in .44 Smith & Wesson in the United States and typically did not have cartridge information stamped on the gun, standard practice for most commercial firearms at the time. Model 3 revolvers were later produced in assortment of calibers for the significance of this pistol in Jesse James' life. He would give it to Robert Ford as a gift for his service in his gang. However, he didn't know it would be his own downfall. Unbeknownst to Jesse James, the Ford brothers had made an agreement with Governor Crittenden that they would bring him James, dead or alive. They would receive a $5,000 payment, and their crimes would be all dismissed. On April 3rd, 1882, after eating breakfast, the Fords and James went into the living room before traveling to Platte City for a robbery. From the newspaper, James had just learned that his gang member, Dick Little, had confessed to participating in a murder he was suspicious the Fords hadn't told him about. Robert Ford later said he believed that James had realized they were there to betray him, so instead of confronting them, James walked across the living room and laid his revolvers on the sofa. He turned around and noticed a dusty picture above the mantel and stood on the chair to clean it. Robert Ford drew out his Schofield Model No. 3 that James gave him and shot him unarmed, right in the back of the head. James' 2 previous bullet wounds and partially missing middle finger served to positively identify his body. The death of Jesse James became a national sensation. The governor's quick pardon suggested he knew the brothers had intentions to kill James rather than capture him. The implication that the chief executive of Missouri conspired to kill a private citizen startled the public and added to Jesse James' legend and notoriety. After receiving a small portion of the reward, the Fords fled Missouri. Sheriff James Timberlake and Marshal Henry H. Craig, who were law enforcement officials active in the plan, were awarded the majority of the bounty. Later, the Ford brothers starred in a touring stage show in which they reenacted the shooting. Public opinion that it had been for the outlaw to be stopped suffering from tuberculosis and a morphine addiction, Charlie Ford committed suicide on May 6, 1884. Bob Ford operated a tent saloon in Creede, Colorado, loaded a double-barrel shotgun, entered Ford's saloon and said, "Hello, Bob," before shooting Ford in the throat, killing him instantly, calling him the coward that killed Jesse James. Forever, James will be known as a folk hero, robber, terrorist, Confederate.